And so I'll talk about those. And then there are two pretty fundamental changes that got made that make the order problematic for us. And I want to focus on those in particular and explain that situation to you. So I'll start out by directing you to the requested changes that we asked for to finding 28. And we understand the importance of adequately dealing with anti-degradation compliance in this order. And so we're offering two changes that we think do that. One is in the introductory paragraph to clarify for executive officers at regional boards that they would need to provide reasons why this order should not be applied and not just make a conclusory statement to that effect. So we're asking that they would provide evidence as to what aspect of the project they believe.
You mean formal evidence?
I don't mean evidence.
That seems a little extreme.
I don't mean evidence in a formal sense, but if they're going to conclude that a particular project doesn't comply with the conditions listed in finding 28, we'd want to see an explanation of that of some sort, rather than just a conclusory statement that it does not.
I think the intention is that they would explain it. What are you
that's
worried about? You're worried about a wave of the wand, them being
Yes.
peremptory?
Yeah, we've seen it.
Just as people worry the other way that they're going to say yes to everything.
And here we're just asking for an explanation as to why they want to issue an individual order or think recycling is inappropriate under the terms of this order. And then we're asking for, in subparagraphs A and B, just some clarity as to what is meant by anti-degradation policy compliance, and we think that that's been very clearly laid out in the preceding findings. I listed 22 through 28, and it really should be 22 through 27. So the preceding findings in the anti-degradation section of the order, I think, lay out clearly what hurdle the projects have to meet in order to qualify for this order, and we think it's appropriate to specify that as a statement of how a recycling project ought to comply with the anti-degradation policy. Finding 29, I want to especially recognize the value of that to water recyclers and thank the board staff for recognizing that and proposing it. We would like to clarify, though, that not just continued operation of a project under an existing permit should be allowed, but those existing projects should be allowed to continue to expand under the terms of that order, if that order does allow expansion of a project, continue to allow expansion. So we're proposing a change there to clarify that because we believe that was staff's intent. A prohibition A3, and I think it's clear from the prohibitions that your intent is to allow what is defined as incidental runoff, and but the prohibitions don't explicitly exempt incidental runoff from a discharge prohibition, so we're asking that that be added. Finding C5, sorry, in the operative section of the permit, paragraphs C5 and C13 appear to us to be essentially the same, almost word for word, and so we're suggesting that one of those ought to be deleted, and then, as has been the case in several other instances, add the word or its agent after administrator in either one of those paragraphs, whichever one is retained, or in both if the decision is made to retain both. The order in attachment A, the NOI, that is the notice of intent where a recycler puts forward his intent to comply with the terms of this order for review by the regional board, is asked to submit engineering reports, which are required under Title 22. They have been prepared for many years. They can be very large in size and weight, and we're not sure it makes sense for a recycler to provide those again, because they already have been provided to Department of Public Health, which pretty soon the Drinking Water Division will be part of your organization, we expect. And so it's not practical, we don't think, to require the resubmittal of engineering reports. If they haven't been submitted, it's a new project, fine, submit them, but we don't think it makes sense to require them to be submitted. And so just simply providing an approval letter documenting to the regional board staff that those engineering reports have been approved would seem to meet the needs. And then if there are specific questions about a project, then engineering report elements can be provided or discussion had as needed. Attachment A, section 2B3, there's one word in there, the word "and," really affects the meaning of that sentence. And this section reflects the recycled water policy, or I believe it is intended to. And so in order to be consistent with the recycled water policy, we'd like that word "and" removed, because if that word "and" stays in there, you end up with having to do a bunch of stuff together when only some of it might make sense to do. I think the intent was to list, for example, the kind of things that might need to be done, rather than giving a choice of other appropriate actions or one fixed set of requirements. So we request the deletion of the word "and."
Which section was that again, Mr.
I'm sorry,
Smith?
that is in attachment A, section 2B3.
Page 18? A2, thank you.
I'm sorry, let me find the page number that it's on.
I found it, thank you.
You may have noticed, as we did, that attachment B, the monitoring and reporting program, is essentially all new as of Friday night. And we don't quarrel with most aspects of that attachment B. There is two pieces of it, though, that really, and this is where we get into the fundamental concern we have here with the order as before you, and that is that the frequency of monitoring for a number of constituents is not feasible for many recyclers to comply with. The way the program is specified now, the recycler needs to visit every use site once a month. And we have programs that have hundreds and thousands of use sites. And so getting to each one of them once a month isn't feasible. It would make recycling under this order infeasible. And I think one of the goals here is to create a program or a permit that fosters recycling. And this is a hurdle over which many recyclers could not get over and would not be able to use this permit because they could not comply with it. And so we have identified alternative language that reflects a sentiment that is already stated in the monitoring and reporting program, which is flexibility. We very much appreciate the recognition of staff in writing other parts of this section that certain parts of the program as written may not apply to certain recycling programs, and that recyclers ought to be prepared to describe for the regional board what parts do make sense to implement. And we think that this requirement of monthly inspections isn't feasible and is not consistent with that desire for an expectation of flexibility. And so we've proposed alternative language that we believe provides that flexibility and gives the regional board the basis to review a proposed recycling monitoring program and work with the recycler, the administrator, to impose one that will protect beneficial uses. And my last concern that I'll express here this morning is to state that in the on page B5, the reporting deadline, given all the information that's asked for here, to collect it and provide it within 1 month of the close of the reporting period, that is on February 1st, that is not feasible for a number of recyclers either, and we would request that February 1st date on B5 be changed to April 1st. So I'll close by again expressing my respect and appreciation to staff and you all for your commitment to recycling. And it's been a pleasure to be working with this board and staff on a number of water recycling initiatives we have together, and I look forward to continue doing that. So I'm happy to answer any questions about my comments or move to the next speaker as the chair wishes.
Questions? Thanks for putting it this way. I have a quick question because maybe I was trying to read what we had versus what you had when you got to it. When the 4 years on cross, is that for cross connections? No, cooling, industrial. What does 17 and 22 say? Because you took out or more frequently at the discretion of CDPH, and instead you said, so you wanted at least every 4 years and take away the discretion of CDPH to inspect more often?
I think what we were trying to do is seek wording that is consistent with the authority of CDPH as it exists under Title 22 today.
Which is what?
And so let's make sure we're looking at the same proposed change here. So could you direct me to exactly?
It's right, just up, next to the last comment on the last page.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. The testing shall be performed at least every 4 years and then delete or more frequently at the discretion of CDPH. The Title 22 specifies every 4 years, and so we're just asking that the Title 22 be reflected in here, in the order.
You're saying that it does not include the phrase or more frequently, et
Correct.
cetera.
Thank you, yes.
I know, but
But
there's
it
nothing
does-
wrong with occasional additional testing, is there?
Yes, there can be.
Which is what? And
Yeah, please seek Brian's input as well. But the concern we have is that testing can lead to, sometimes involves shutting down water in a system. And when we talk about some facilities, shutdown testing is a fatal flaw for recycling. And we want to minimize the amount of shutdown testing required.
yeah, I'm just trying to balance with, and we'll talk about this in the discussion, concerns over this, great source of water, but one that some folks are concerned about it. And so sometimes I think more testing can give the public the confidence that they need, because I'm thinking of the long ball game of really expanding recycled water, but you need a lot of public confidence to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't seem awful, but I don't know that the DPH has been, well, you can answer this for us,
Yeah,
is sort of a
our
willy-nilly tester.
Let me just say, our regulation says at least once every 4 years,
So
so
you do
that's
have
the way it's
discretion, right?
worded, to have some discretion. I mean, it is typically just every 4 years, but there are maybe some cases, I can't quote any right now, so I don't know it's been used too often, but I think we want to definitely protect public health, and if we think something is needed, then it should be done more frequently. So that would be, I'm sure Dave agrees with that. And so I think we've worked on that quite well, with discretion.
And the language that we're proposing reflects that statement, that representation of the.
So you're saying that the language we put in is duplicative of what the statute requires? I'm getting nodding from the back of
And
the room.
simply
Thank you,
referring to
nodders.
Title
That's always
22.
helpful. What?
Simply referring to Titles 2017 and
Okay.
22 would be
Okay.
the most
You could
accurate
do
way
it
to
either
do it,
way.
in our view.
Okay.
So let me get this clear, and Brian, please help me out here. The term as specified in Titles 17 and 22, does that explicitly provide for CDPH or the drinking water program's discretion to require additional testing. Because if not, I would strongly oppose removing that discretionary language from this order.
The regulation, to quote, says the recycled system shall also be tested for possible cross connections at least once every 4 years. So it's vague, but I mean, that's the minimum frequency.
I think I would be more comfortable leaving the language in there specifying the discretion of CDPH.
Yeah, Board Member Tam, I was going to recommend the same thing. Part of the reason in these areas we reference CDPH directly is that the applicants are required to submit a Title 22 engineering report to CDPH. And sometimes part of the review of that CDPH, based on the conditions and the request, the CDPH may make adjustments that will be consistent with Title 17 and 22, but within their discretion. So we thought it was more appropriate to reference CDPH determination than just the statutes.
Yeah, on that point, since Brian was at the mic, I wanted to ask him about that comment that Mr. Smith asked about having an approval letter in lieu of an engineering report if, let's say, in a previous order or, you know, that there's an engineering report for a project on file. What's your comfort level with having the approval letter sent as part of a NOI package for this particular order?
I think that might be workable. However, in addition to an approval letter, I think the issue is sometimes these reports are so old that they need to be updated. I've seen cases where they've switched from chlorine to UV and not notified anybody. And so that does happen. Those things fall through the cracks, and we never got notice. The boards may or may not have got notice. I know we didn't get notice, and certainly we would want to comment on a change in disinfection. So I would say a report update, which could be, you know, a smaller document, a letter, and previous approval letter.
So the way to resolve that would be to put in something that says any updates. If there's been an update,
Yes.
they need to have it. Or
They could
that-
say there's been no changes,
Yeah.
you know, swear there's been no changes or whatever, or provide change. And usually there is some minor changes, maybe, you know.
So you could provide changes, or you'd still want to be able to, you'd still want to be able to, thank you for modeling that assistance behavior. And probably don't have to say it, but to be clear that the reports can be provided on request,
Yes,
but that you want them to affirmatively say whether there's been any change or not.
yes, because we wouldn't know. We have very limited staff to be able to see these sites, and we focus on the drinking water, obviously.
Right. It becomes challenging for all of you if you can't, if it's really old, it's hard. Are those engineering reports available to the public in your files if they want to see them?
You know, they're spread out through our different district offices. Historically, they've been around, you know, in Southern California especially, they've been doing it for 20, 30 years, and they haven't been updated, you know, so.
No, but if a member
they're
of the
not-
public wanted to see the engineering reports, they could come in and ask to see them in one of your
yes,
offices, right?
Hopefully we could find them.
Right. Well, and then if you couldn't find them, you could ask for it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, on this issue, I think, you know, the recyclers are pointing out, you know, it's can be non-trivial to pull together the old report and that sort of thing. So they're looking for a streamlined process, but giving you full discretion, you know, to evaluate whether, you know, the previous approvals are sufficient. Is that right, Mr. Smith? So
Exactly. And I think that the date on the approval letter would trigger a review of whether it appears current or not. If there's some concern, then that discussion can be had between the administrator and the regional board.
Right. So this is not a rubber stamp. It's just it's instructions on what needs to be submitted, and then there's still discretion after the submission.
Yeah, we may
That's
need
my
to
sense.
be clear about that. I don't want to go, Dave, you're going to be here all day, right?
For as long
Or
as
as
need
long
be.
as we're here, right? Because I do want to be able to hear the comments from everybody else before we go through and consider, and hopefully people are trying take notes on some of the changes, and I'm going to want to give staff some time to integrate, but I still have a question. One is, because it went fast, the use site monitoring program, your language versus our language. I mean, one of the reasons why this is in here is because the public in some cases has a concern that they've seen stuff pool, they've seen stuff run off, and they don't feel like enough care is being taken, or that people who get one of these permits are going to be as careful about compliance with the language of it. I understand your point about the fact that in some cases, particularly some of the industrial ones or others where you've got a lot of different sites, it's going to be difficult. So I'm sensitive to the fact that you might not really have to look at it everywhere in order to know, but you want to be able to look everywhere you ought to look. Can you just explain, and during a break I can compare the two more closely, what kind of changes were you intending to make in this new version? What
So-
was your intent?
Good, thank you. There's a table on page B3 that lists pond system monitoring parameters, freeboard odors, and berm condition, and the sampling frequency is specified as monthly. There's a table on page B4 that describes the monitoring requirements for each use site. And we have no issue and aren't proposing changes to the first 4 rows in that table. The subsequent 4 rows, we are proposing that the monitoring frequency be as you just suggested it should be, Madam Chair, which is specific to the complexity of the site. And so you'll see in our proposed language, in the second sentence, which starts on the 3rd line, the frequency of use site inspections shall be based on the complexity and risk of each use site. And our expectation is that if this language is included in the permit as we propose, then the NOI would include a proposed monitoring program that the regional board is in a position to react to. And if there are particular concerns about particular sites, the regional board can specify frequency, and that can be worked out between the administrator and the regional board on a case-by-case basis. But to specify monthly monitoring for every site, it's a deal killer.
Okay.
Yeah, and one thing, I did a little bit of research. I was looking at the San Francisco Bay Region Master Reclamation Permit on this issue.
9611, yes.
Yeah, 96011. Just because I received your correspondence yesterday, so I was doing my own review, and the language, and you can corroborate this or not, but I read 9611 as having an at least annually frequency for these type of visual observations. So this order, in my reading, went to monthly, whereas the regional board's general order was on at least annually, which would provide for regional board discretion for more frequent observations. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, and we would ask that discretion for less frequent monitoring be allowed as well. I could name several sites that less frequent monitoring is appropriate, and I could name a bunch of sites where more frequent monitoring is appropriate, and that ought to be worked out between the recycler and the regional board, not specified here as monthly, because it's not feasible to attain that.
Could you give an example of a site that maybe less than annual would be appropriate, just based on your experience, and then a site where more frequent would be appropriate,
Sure.
site-specific?
We've got irrigation sites of a agricultural nature that are bermed, and they're intensely managed agriculture, and so where they don't want to lose water, and they're designed to retain water. And
With adequate freeboard.
yes, and so we see some flood irrigation operations where there is full containment, and where those conditions exist, we don't think annual monitoring may be necessary. In some cases, though, there are design flaws, if you will. In other words, recycled water is being used at a facility that was designed in an era when water conservation was not a priority. And so runoff is occurring by design. And when those sites get upgraded to improve the irrigation system, those systems need to be inspected more often, in my view, to verify that they're functioning appropriately, and then maybe the frequency can be decreased. And where there's instances of poor management on the part of a site supervisor, higher level of monitoring is required in order to verify that the site supervisor or the site is being managed after there's recognition that it hasn't been managed well. So there's a range of needs out there, and I don't think a one-size-fits-all specified here as monthly would be productive or feasible. And it would severely impair recyclers' ability to use this permit. They would not, most of them.
But would you say that it's rare that annual inspection is, I mean, that you would need, well, how to put this? Most sites will need at least annual. There will be some sites that might not, but most would.
Take a system that has 4,000 residential connections. The utility of inspecting each of those annually,
Yeah.
you know, I can't argue in favor of that. Looking at some of them annually makes sense, but this says each one monthly.
Huh. Interesting. Interesting.
I think there's a little bit of confusion about the monitoring, and I've reviewed Dave's proposed changes, and they're really not very different than what's proposed in the order right now.
Right. That's what I'm trying to understand.
As it's written, the administrator monitors use areas at a frequency appropriate to determine compliance. So that's the threat and complexity issue that Dave is talking about. And the administrator may also assign monitoring requirements to a user as part of the water recycling permit program. So the user will be receiving the water. Presumably, they'll be at the site while they'll be applying the water. So performing these monitoring requirements should be relatively easy for a user. And then in terms of these, the issue of hundreds of residential sites or something like that, the language that Dave is providing is very similar to what's already in the proposed MRP. Use areas that consist of small lots, for example, residential industrial developments, may be aggregated to combine acreage for calculation purposes. So I don't think that there's a huge difference between what Dave is asking for and what's already in the proposed MRP.
Tim, could I ask for clarification, where in the proposed language that you proposed, does it give discretion to the administrator to delegate that monthly site monitoring responsibility to the user?
It's the second sentence in the use area monitoring section. It says an administrator may assign monitoring responsibilities to a user as part of the water recycling use permit program.
Thank you.
So I have a question on that, focusing on ag for a moment. And one of the, first of all, I think staff, I just really want to compliment everybody because you've spent so much time on this, and I've had a lot of questions, and I appreciate the extra time that you've given me, you know, really wanting to make sure that this actually gets used. And the concern that I have, not necessarily on this language, but just the general concern that we not have so many duplicate programs that are out there and duplicate monitoring and all that. And so just wanting to, Tim O'Brien, if you could, talk about irrigated lands and the programs that are with respect to the regions that already have robust programs, and whether or not the user, in other words, that would be the farmer, could just use an irrigated lands program in order to comply. Trying to address the issue of duplicate monitoring and reporting.
I'm sorry, Tim gave me the sign. It was me.
Okay.
There is no intent in this order to duplicate monitoring and sampling requirements. If the monitoring is happening at the production facility, the user doesn't have to do it. If there is another order, a WDR, that has requirements in it, this does not, we don't intend that this would duplicate any of those requirements. We do have irrigated lands. The regulatory program is a three-phase program, where in the first phase it includes monitoring and reporting requirements. In the second phase, if any of the monitoring and reporting identifies impaired areas, then BMP implementation is initiated. And in the third phase, demonstration projects are identified to look at the effectiveness of those BMPs. So particularly in the Central Valley region, the Central Coast region, and the Los Angeles region, they're well underway in the irrigated lands program, and they have control mechanisms and MRPs in place already. There are others that are not as far along, but this is the irrigated lands program is implementing these monitoring and reporting programs all across the state right now.
But I'm not, could you point out exactly where that is? Because if I read B4, use area monitoring, an administrator may assign monitoring responsibilities, but then those responsibilities are listed under the chart. So how would an irrigated lands program control as opposed to what's on this chart?
Board Member Didi, this is Shala Parnok. There is a provision and there's a language in the in attachment B, page 2, that may specifically speak to your concern, and if that's not the case, then we can further. In the middle of the page, there is a language saying that monitoring requirements listed below may duplicate existing requirements under other orders. Duplication of sampling activities is not required if the monitoring activity complies with the requirements of this order. So basically, if they have, the intent was that if there was monitoring that was being done under other program, they do not need to redo the monitoring, but as part of the annual reports, administrator could reference or provide those results. And I'm not sure if that was specific. And then there's several areas in the order that we have specifically recognized that some of the irrigated lands may be other orders, and we have language specifically saying that this requirement doesn't apply to those. So if you would like, I could point those out as well.
Yeah, I'm just thinking with this being specific as to the use area monitoring and it stating monthly, I don't know what the irrigated lands program would require, but whether or not, maybe we just need to make it more clear.
We could possibly put a language in the monitoring and reporting program as part of the order that's consistent with what we put out in other places where it specifically references those facilities that are under irrigated lands program.
Can you think a little bit at a break about how to navigate it? Because you've done a lot, but even looking at use area monitoring, and I'm conscious of the fact that you've done this, and I appreciate it in response to very specific concerns that came from some of the public comments on this, but it is a little confusing even in use area monitoring where it says the following shall be recorded for each user with additional reporting for use areas as appropriate. So you have, well, that's additional reporting as appropriate. And then the last line said use area reporting shall include the following, and you've got to go somewhere else to see that there's an ability to not do some of these monthly. So it is a little hard. The intent, I'm inclined, I'm more of a, at this stage of the world, more monitoring is better than less, but I don't want to be ridiculous about it in a situation where you've got a zillion connections. Not just the 4,000's one where there's a way, but just even within the paragraph, it's hard to know what it means.
I also want to point out that at the very beginning of the monitoring and reporting program, it says that the administrator shall not implement any changes to the MRP unless a revised MRP is issued by the executive officer. So the intent is that this is a template, and the executive officer, when they issue the notice of applicability, will issue an MRP that's appropriate. They wouldn't put the pond requirements, for example, in if there were no ponds there.
All right,
So
then it's just maybe changing the word that says use area monitoring shall include the following at the end of that thing, which seems to negate everything else. Stuff like that. If you could just do a read-through for that, I'm not against being reasonable. In fact, you want to be reasonable, but I also want to make sure it's clear that the more monitoring is a good idea for now.
We can certainly look at the comments and the language over the break.
Yeah, that'd
to
be
look at it, but in general, I'd like to mention, the reason attachment B is revised was in response to comments that we received, because some commenters thought the original version, it was not clear, and it was specifically just mentioning certain type of uses. And we also thought that having the requirements in a tabulated format, it would make it easier for the regional boards as they continue to issue these, and for those that need to comply.
No,
to go
in
with.
general, I think you did a great job.
And the intent was not to make it more stringent, but we had to balance the comments we got.
Chair Marcus,
Yeah, sir.
I'm not sure this is what you're asking, but it might be, and so I want to clarify, is another approach to what you're asking is that if there is an existing or order, such as an irrigated lands order, that requires a slightly different monitoring scheme, but for the same purpose, like making sure that you're applying water at ergonomic rates, that you've got the nitrogen, that you're not overflowing your ponds, but they word it slightly different because it's a different order, that the executive officer can allow for substitute monitoring that satisfies the needs of this requirement. Is that what you're asking?
That's not what I was getting. I think that's responsive to Board Member Diadamo, which is great. I don't disagree with. I was just being a lawyer, looking at the language that seemed to not give any flexibility to monthly sampling for every single thing. And I can envision places where you would err on the side of caution, because there are places where the community feels that the existing orders aren't being protective or enforced. And then, but in other places, it wouldn't make sense, as Dave mentioned. So I just,
Okay.
the shall include the following seems to negate everything that came before. That's all
Gotcha.
I'm just being a lawyer at Pinhead here on this one. All right, we will have more questions. I want to get to more comments. I don't think we should give any direction or make any decisions till we hear from everybody. But thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Appreciate
Thank you
it.
for your attention.
We'll come back.
Excuse me, Chair Marcus and members of the board. I just wanted to, Victoria Whitney, Deputy Director for Water Quality. I just wanted to clarify that in addition to Dave Smith's comments that we received yesterday afternoon, we got 2 other comments on the change sheet. One was from Civiqua. We received it at 11 last night. And the other one was from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. We received that one at 7:30 this morning, and I emailed them to you a few minutes ago. So you should have all 3 sets of those comments electronically.
So
Debbie Webster from Civic was here. I'm sure she'll tell you her comments on her own. I don't see Paul Forsberg from Fish and Wildlife, but I can summarize his comments at the end if you'd like.
you could tell us now, just as a teaser.
Basically, he said that he supports the order. He also noted that a lot of the wildlife refuges are irrigated, much like other irrigated lands, and he's asking us just to call out wildlife refuge use as a Title 22 use that's approved by the order. If you'd like to do that, we can do it. I don't think it really makes any difference either way, because as long as they're complying with Title 22, they can use the order, whether it's called out or not. But
All right,
I'll leave
think
that up to
about
you.
that and we will come back. All right, next we have Tess Dunham for the Central Valley Clean Water Association. There you go.
Thank you. Teston with Cemex and Dunn, and Debbie's got a couple of other things, but I'm going to go in the opposite direction of what I was going to comment. I'm going to go ahead and start with the question that Dee Dee just made with respect to the use area monitoring and the irrigated lands orders, being fairly familiar with all of those. And I will tell you that this would be new additional monitoring, right, on top of all the current irrigated lands programs. You know, there's reporting, there's watershed monitoring, there's groundwater trend monitoring. There is not monitoring that is specific like this that's being proposed for the use area within the irrigated lands orders. So it would be new in addition. So really what then results is a person under the ag order, if they are using recycled water, they're going to have different requirements than if they're using a non-recycled water for their irrigation. So they're going to be managing how they comply with their reporting requirements for irrigated lands and for this order differently based just on the fact of their irrigation supply.
The thing I can't remember is in the irrigation, well, we've only done one appeal of one of the orders, and I know the Central Valley one is up on appeal, but, or some of them are, right? Some are, some aren't, some aren't
Most
done.
of them are.
We'll be spending, but are most of them done already?
They are all done.
They're all done now?
They are all done.
Okay.
So, or at least for the valley, yeah.
All right. And then do they all deal with nitrogen application at some measure that would include any higher nitrogen application that might come from a recycled water source? Is that part of the calculation? I'm just not remembering.
Well, I think a lot of that is, part of what the expert panel is addressing, but how it currently exists within the Central Valley Irrigated Lands Program orders is if you, after the coalition does a groundwater assessment report, if an area is found to be a high vulnerability for nitrogen, then there are requirements against everybody, but there's stepped up requirements in areas where you have high vulnerability. And they have the requirements require growers starting in about 2 years to do nitrogen plan summary reports. The template for those summary plan reports, none has been approved yet by the regional board. It's in process and discussion as far as what is all the information that will go on this summary report. So whether it's total pounds applied, how much is in your water, that all of that is still under somewhat negotiation with respect to the template for the summary report. So but that doesn't start till about 2016. It's an annual, it has to be certified by a CCA. Right, so that's the other component here is there's a CCA certification with that, and I'm not sure how this plays out with the use area requirements here when you're using recycled water. I would say the main two things that are similar, though, Chair Marcus, is the idea is that, encouraging growers, yes, look at the amount of nitrogen in your irrigation water, make your determination of your total amount needed in consideration of that, and that definitely is part of the whole process that we want to make sure all growers consider in making good nitrogen management decisions.
Right, which includes the surface water.
Includes any water supply, whether it's recycled water, groundwater, surface water, the whole idea is that consider it. So to the extent, to me, if you're using recycled water or some other water supply, it doesn't really matter because you're still going to be considering that information as part of your nitrogen management decision.
Right, but both for the purpose of understanding what might percolate to the groundwater and what might run off to surface water.
That and more so for plant need, right?
Right.
How much extra, if I can avoid applying extra amount of nitrogen because I've got an extra amount of my water supply.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Ms. Dunham, are you familiar with the use of master reclamation permits for agriculture in other regions besides Central Valley, Central Coast, and how much of I read here that the administrator, the recycler, the producer, may in many cases meet the monitoring requirements for the users, and there's flexibility in the proposed order that way. Do you have any insight as far as other agricultural users of recycled water in existing permit programs?
I don't, Board Member Moore, but I would say, though, that I think that the language that Water Reuse has proposed helps to allow the administrator to work in with their ag users as well, so they can make sure that those monitoring requirements would be consistent. So I think that could take that into consideration. So,
okay.
So then the other, I wanted to also provide a little bit of insight. Well, first I do want to say I really do appreciate staff and all the extra effort they went into, in particular, to try to call out the differences between landscape irrigation and ag irrigation. You know, we had quite a few conversations about that, and I do believe that the changes that have been made go a long way to make sure that that recognizes the difference between the two, and I appreciate all of those changes. But I also wanted to help provide a little bit of insight on the findings 28 that Water Reuse put forward, and maybe I can help provide some clarifications to the language that was there that Dave was talking about. Now, for the general introductory paragraph before you get to A and B, it talks about identifying the evidence that supports requiring a site-specific order in writing. And I just wanted to note that this language I actually took from 13267 of the Water Code. If a regional board is issuing a technical or a monitoring report under 13267, it basically requires them to put in writing their reasons for issuing that and the evidence as to why, you know, they're issuing it. So it's not a, do you have to, you know, show by, you know, substantial evidence why you're making these findings, but it's identification of the evidence that you're doing for any finding, whether you're following Topanga or any case law, of course, requires you to identify the evidence that you're using to support your findings. So it's just to help clarify that. With respect to the actual language provisions in subsections A and B, why we are providing the changes is I think that the way the revisions are proposed, it kind of suggests that there would never be any site-specific order because it doesn't comply with anti-DAG, and I don't think that's the intent. I think the intent of the language, as I read what staff was proposing, is that if the proposed project isn't consistent with the anti-degradation findings in this general order, then the regional board could require that they come under a site-specific order, and then they'd have to make anti-degradation findings under that site-specific order. They might require a higher level of treatment. They might require, you know, something new in addition to make sure it's compliant, but it's that it doesn't meet anti-deg in this order. As it's currently drafted, it's pretty broad and just says doesn't comply with anti-deg, which you have to. You can't not have a project that doesn't comply with anti-deg. So I think it's just that's the changes we are proposing just to help clarify, I think, the intent.
So that's the intent, and the intent in that change is that the language that staff, wait, I'm looking at, there are two different places I have to look. So staff said, changed it to is not consistent with the anti-deg policy as opposed to discharge will degrade water quality to an unacceptable extent. And what you all propose
is not consistent with basically the anti-deg findings of this order.
Of this order.
Of this order.
Okay, I'll
Yeah.
just have to look at that.
Yeah, so that was the reason for our changes, is just to basically say, well, we can't find your project consistent with the anti-deg findings as they've been made for the general order, so then we think you might need to go under a site-specific order. And then the regional board would have to make anti-deg findings underneath the site-specific order. That's all I got.
Thank
You know,
you.
Yeah, and on that point, I'll be interested in staff response, because on the face of it, I can be kind of simple-minded sometimes, and simply, it almost feels like, well, this is consistent with itself. You know, it's almost like circular. Well, finding 29 says 22 through 27, we're consistent with that, and it almost is there value added by making that statement, or better value added by linking to the general anti-degradation policy?
Right.
Yeah, and I was just concerned that by just saying it, you know, the proposed use of recycled water is not consistent with the anti-deg policy. Well, it could be consistent with the anti-deg under the site-specific order. That's the whole reason why they'd be doing it. Not that it's consistent with the anti-deg findings here. That's why we were trying to narrow the intent.
Yeah.
Oh,
So.
okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. I suggest we take I'm going to try and make it a 12-minute break and come back right at 11. It's rude to not take a bio break in the middle of the morning, so see y'all.
You can have Rachel Pontius come down.
Yeah.